um, approximately 45 people in the room or joining the room now. And I'm going to start this afternoon's proceedings. So welcome everybody. I'm a little bit distracted because I'm clicking the admit button as I speak. So for those that don't know me, I'm Neville Swade and I run the Access program. And we have commenced this series of discussions and talks mainly because we felt that there really needs to be more dialogue around some of the real big global issues as they pertain to us globally, as well as how they matter to us down here in Southern Africa. And in fact, it was the fires of California that prompted us to really think about this, because these are major global events which which really matter to global climate system and directly or indirectly impact upon us down here. And so the idea is to create this platform for this kind of discussion. We've had one before, which was on law, which was much more parochial. And then this is our second one. I'm very glad to have two really excellent experts and speakers today to tell us a little bit about their perspectives on wildfires. I'll introduce them in a minute. I just want to say that the plan is to do at least one more, if not two more, of these events later this year. The next one, I will show you the preliminary invitation for, is going to look at some of the big biodiversity reports that have fairly recently been published. We haven't confirmed these speakers, but you will all hear about this if you registered for this one or the previous one. And then following this, we hope to have one which is going to look at some of the ice melting and Arctic ice melting issues. So we will look at fire and ice. So that's really what this is all about. I won't take any more time up talking about that. I just want to welcome you all again, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have two today. We have Hugh Safford from the USA in California, and we have Sally Archibald from South Africa, Wits University. And they're both going to speak for a period of time, and then afterwards we hope to make time for some questions and answers and discussions around the topic. The topic is fairly self-explanatory, as you've seen in the invitation. And so what I will do now is introduce our first speaker, who is Hugh Safford. And Hugh, you can share your screen when you're ready to. And while you do that, I will tell you what I know about you, who I discovered through some efforts in trying to learn about who's who in California fire management, and was recommended you, and I'm really, really grateful that he's been able to join us. It's really early in California and cold, he tells me. So he's a regional ecologist for the USDA Forest Services in the Pacific Southwest region, which includes California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Territories, and a member of a research faculty in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. He manages a staff of Forest Service ecologists that provide expertise in vegetation, fire and restoration ecology, climate change, inventory, and monitoring of the national forests in the Pacific Southwest region. The Safford Lab at UC Davis is focused on applied ecology support to resource and fire management in California, neighboring states, and other Mediterranean climate regions. So we have a really expert presenter today who is going to give us a sense of the scale and the challenges that he faces and they face in managing this problem in California. So Hugh, thanks again, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I have to warn people, I could be coughing and hacking a little bit. I'm actually in Idaho in a soulless conference room in a hotel in an exterior room that's very poorly insulated, and it's about -10 outside right now. So I'm absolutely freezing. Anyway, I will share my screen. Let's see here. All right, Neville, let me know if this comes up.
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, good. Well, I'm going to start. I've got about 35 minutes worth of slides, and I'm going to have to move relatively quickly. Usually, as usual, I have too much to say. Let me start my timer so I can keep track of myself here. Just a second. Great. Anyway, some ruminations on fire trends. So let's see here. Can we make this thing move? There we go. Okay, this is an outline of what I'd like to talk about today. So I'm going to talk generally about overall long-term trends in California wildfires. I'm going to spend some time talking about the biophysical environment in California and its relation to climate, fire, and fuels. I'll focus a little bit on this year's fire events. And then in what I think is an important section, I'm going to talk about fire and fuels issues and the dominant ecosystems in Northern and Southern California. I'll try to convince you that it's basically two different nations, the northern and southern halves of California. And if you've been to California, you know that they're different nations anyway. And then I'll finish with some thoughts on climate change and management options as well. This thing is responding slowly. There we go. Okay, so a couple of background slides to begin. This is just simply to underline the fact for you, which I'm sure most of you already know, that California is the center of the fire issue, the wildfire issue in the US and North America for that matter. If you rank the worst wildfires in terms of insured economic loss in US history, they're all in California. That's certainly the top 10 are, and if you go to the top 50, maybe there are 7 or 8 that aren't in California. And you can see that in the last couple of years, we've had some really extraordinarily catastrophic fires with thousands and thousands of structures destroyed and dozens of deaths and insured losses, and almost nearly $10 billion from a single fire in 2018. So here's the temporal trend in structures destroyed by wildfires. By structures, I mean, we're talking primarily homes, but this is also commercial buildings, churches, gas stations, garages, things like that. And we've long told people for decades and decades that they can expect, 200 to 500 homes to be burned in an average year in California by wildfires, which seems extraordinary. But then when you look at the last 5 years, the average is closer to 10,000 a year. And the insurance industry is beginning to take note of this, dropping a lot of insurance policies on homes in high wildfire risk areas right now. It's a big issue in the news in California. Economic cost of wildfires is increasing geometrically. Again, the last 4 years, we've averaged nearly $10 billion in insured economic loss from wildfires. And of course, this isn't taking into account uninsured economic loss. In a lot of the rural communities that are burned down, those people don't have insurance, so who knows what they lost. So here's the actual trend. This is for the whole state of California. And you'll see, an inexorable increase over time with the trend really taking off in the last 3 or 4 years in particular. The red circles denote years in which more than 4,000 square kilometers burned, which is about 1 million acres. And so that tends to be something that catches people's attention in California. I'll note that all of those really big years were very dry years in which broad scale ignition clusters happened. Many of them, they were lightning clusters, and other ones, they were broad scale wind events, Santa Ana winds and Diablo winds in the San Francisco Bay Area that caused power lines to break. So this slide will provide sort of a template for a lot of the rest of my discussion in this presentation. And what I've done here is I've split burned area between 1980 and 2020 between what I'll broadly call Northern California and Southern California. And what you'll note is, although until really just a few years past, all of us thought that the fire problem, as it were, was strongly focused in Southern California. Really what the graphic shows is that it's not, that indeed burned area has barely budged in Southern California for 40 years, whereas it has absolutely exploded in Northern California. And in fact, all of that increase that you saw in the last slide is happening in the northern parts of the state and in the Sierra Nevada. So let's talk about ecological regions in California. I want to convince you that it's not just climate having a lot of this. There's a whole lot of environment, fuels, vegetation type, extent of fuels as well involved. And so I want to note that strange tooth-looking like polygon that's in blue at the top, I'm going to broadly call that Northern California. And the red polygon I'm going to broadly call Southern California, although it includes part of the west coast of California as well. And the conditions and trends in the two places are very, very different. All right, so first of all, let's talk about vegetation. Northern part of the state is dominated by conifer forests. Southern part of the state is dominated by chaparral shrublands, along with some coastal sage shrublands, and also large areas of oak forest and oak wood. In terms of precipitation, the northern part of the state is quite wet, whereas the southern part of the state is really quite dry. So this is a graphic from the Land Fire Program mapping hypothesized quote unquote natural fire regimes, that is before Euro-American settlement en masse after about 1850. And this is based largely on the fire scar dendrochronology network, plus some other data sets, particularly for chaparral types. But you'll just note that a northern polygon is largely yellow. And the yellow applies to what we would call fire regime group 1, which are ecosystems that are adapted to very frequent fire that burns typically at very low severity, low flame lengths, generally low spread rates, very little mortality in the overstory. Now, mind you, this is before we started putting out all the fires at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And if you go to the Southern California polygon, you'll note that it's largely orange with some red in the north. These are longer fire return interval ecosystems, places where, for example, we're convinced now that probably the natural fire regime in chaparral is for fire is repeating maybe every 50 to 100 years. This is in contrast to what we thought maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And of course, these systems, when they burn, they invariably burn at high severity. And then I need to talk a little bit about management history here. I won't spend too much time on this, but basically what's happened is these two portions of the state have had very, very different experiences with ignitions and with fire frequencies. Those forest types in the north historically had very low fuels and a large disconnection between the surface fuels and the canopy fuels, and it was quite easy to put fires out in this system. At least for a number of decades, it is no longer quite so easy. And you can see that they're all blue in this graphic. Well, this is from a database that we developed starting about 6 or 7 years ago that tracks current fire frequencies on California landscapes and compares them to the hypothetical, quote unquote, natural fire frequencies. And the cool colors in this map represent places where fire frequencies over the last century, in the case of this particular map, are much lower than they would have been in the centuries preceding Euro-American arrival after about 1850. In Southern California, on the other hand, you'll see it's mostly warm colors, and this actually denotes a landscape where human ignitions have increased fire frequencies notably above the frequencies that we believe that characterize these systems before about 1850. And then you'll see there are a couple of islands of blue in that, and those represent the higher mountains in Southern California. So in terms of ignition sources, this one on the left is this great graphic developed from a publication by Jennifer Balch et al. A couple of years back. And what it does is it combines the number of ignitions, the number of fires rather, with the percent of those fires that are caused by human ignitions. And you can see that Northern California, there's a strong preponderance of lightning ignitions on most of the landscape, except around the Central Valley. And in Southern California, lightning is extremely rare, and almost all ignitions are by humans. And then if you look at the graphic on the right, that just gives you an idea of the lightning strike density in California. It's very low. It's very rare to see lightning west of the Sierra Nevada in particular. So climate change, temperatures have warmed more in the south than they have in the north, notably more in the south. And if you'll compare the map of California to the general map of the United States, you'll see that the extent of climate warming, the focus of climate warming in the lower 48 states is in California and in western Arizona. Some stations in Southern California have seen increases in 2 to 3, and I've even seen some with nearly 4 degrees Celsius increases. There is an urban heat island effect going on there though as well. There are those polygons again. And then finally, this is precipitation patterns over the last century or so. And you can see that Northern California has actually been getting wetter, although at higher elevation, the precipitation is transitioning from primarily to snow to primarily rain. Continue to do that over time. Southern California, precip has mostly gone down. And I'm not going to cover the slide. It's just a summary of what I just talked about. I just covered burned area trends. I don't have to do that again. It's up in Northern California and flat in Southern California. But I want to note that the effects of burning are also very different in these two places. This is a graphic based on the relativized difference normalized, delta normalized burn ratio measures from Landsat channels 4 and 7 that we use now to have been using for a couple decades now to map fire severity. And this is a graphic of the total hectares burned where more than 90% of the dominant biomass was killed by fire. And you can see that it's exponential growth starting in the 2000s. In other words, we're not just having more fire, but the fires are much more destructive, if you will, ecologically speaking. And in Southern California, there's really not a strong trend. We had a big pulse of big extreme fires in the 2000s, largely linked to the drought that Southern California had at that time. Okay, so then in summary, climate change has been much more severe in Southern California. It has, vegetation is generally more flammable in Southern California. Human ignition densities are much higher in Southern California. But the increases in burned area and fire severity are very strongly focused in Northern California. All right, next section. So let's talk a little bit about this year's fires. As I noted before, this was an extraordinary year for fire. We burned more than twice as much area this year as we had in the previous record year, which was only 2 years ago. These are the 10 largest fires from this year, and you can see some truly extraordinarily large fires. The August complex was over 400,000 hectares, more than twice the size of the second largest fire in California history, which, if you can see my cursor, happened exactly to the south of it. We have a national forest here called the Mendocino National Forest, which has seen over 90% of its landscape, of its jurisdictional landscape, burned in the last 3 years. 9 of these fires are over 50,000 hectares. So I'm going to focus on a couple of those in here in just a second. I just want to note that one of the interesting idiosyncrasies of this is that almost all of these fires were caused by this freak accident of nature where a tropical storm 2,000 kilometers south of San Francisco had a bunch of its moisture and unstable air get entrained in a strange dip of the jet stream that shot it right over California. And we had just a lightning show that didn't stop for 4 days from San Francisco north in places that only very rarely see lightning. And this happened at the driest time of the year, and it happened during a record heat outbreak. So as you can imagine, this caused a lot of fires. At one point, there were over 1,000 fires burning. Most of them coalesced into these fires we saw on the map. So one of the things I'd like to note is meteorologists obviously have expounded on this as being a very unique and very rare event, but it's not as rare as people think. These blue arrows denote years where we had large-scale lightning outbreaks. What you can see is that over time, the scale of the fires caused by these outbreaks is obviously increasing, and it's increasing nearly exponentially here at the end. And that's obviously driven by a number of different factors, among them climate warming, drier fuels in the summer, but also increasing fuels in forest types because of the lack of fire. So here are a couple of examples of fires. I spent a bit of time in the late summer, early fall on some of these landscapes. This is the SCU complex. I have a little map at the bottom showing where that is. It's just southeast of San Francisco. This is the third largest fire in California history at this point. But what I want to make clear about these fires is, although the world heard about an extraordinary amount of burning in California, a lot of that burning was actually great stuff, ecologically speaking. This is a fire, for example, that really had relatively little economic impact, burned maybe a couple hundred homes. I'm lamenting that, forgive me, I'm not suggesting that's not an issue, but ecologically speaking, these were normal burning conditions. The broadleaf forests and woodlands were underburned, maybe some canopy torching, but the trees are all going to survive. Chaparral, which was most of the landscape you're looking at here, this is the way it always burns. I mean, to the uninitiated, it looks devastated, but that's what happens. And we're already seeing resprouting 4 weeks after fire. Essentially, this was a giant prescribed fire. This is the Hennessy Fire, just north of the SCU on the other side of the Sacramento River. Very similar landscape to the SCU complex. Again, large areas of just standard burning conditions. This forest on the left was, burned relatively hot in the understory, and although everything's brown, almost all those oaks in that picture are just going to resprout from the crown. The pines will die in that particular photo, but otherwise you won't even know it burned in 3 or 4 years. There was a much more serious human impact of this fire, however. It killed 6 people and about 1,500 homes were lost. And then this is the Creek Fire, and then you can see this is in the southern Sierra Nevada, and this is a very, very different situation. We're concerned about this fire and about the Castle Fire just to its south, because there were huge areas of very severe burning in these fires. The reason is that these areas were the focus of a massive tree mortality event that occurred between 2012 and 16, when we had, any of you who pay any attention to California might remember that we had an amazing drought of 5 years, the worst one that apparently in the last 1,200 years by some reckoning. That left nearly 200 million trees dead in the Sierra Nevada by Forest Service estimates. Obviously, this is a lot of dead fuel. A lot of it had come down, a lot of it was still standing. Some of the burn in the Creek Fire went through areas that had fuels that, believe it or not, had up to 5,000 tons of down material per hectare. It seems extraordinary, but we went out and measured some of it, and it was just unbelievable. This fire spawned multiple fire tornadoes. The fuels generated what we call a mass fire effect, where it created its own localized weather, and actually regional winds were forced around this event because of all the hot rising air. This killed a lot of giant sequoias, and it's the first experience I have with seeing large areas of giant sequoia mortality. We usually think of that species as being nearly impervious. Again, just returning back to the California area burned by wildfires, my point here was just simply that, this is a big year. And so this little yellow bar at the bottom, that's what I meant to say. Again, as I noted, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of hair pulling based on this year's events. A lot of people died, a lot of homes burned, a lot of smoke. I mean, the air was essentially unbreathable for a couple of months, and a lot of us had to flee where we were living for a long time. But the best estimates that are out there of how much area burned before the arrival of Euro-Americans in California was that probably 18,000 square kilometers was an average year before 1800. And we burned almost 18,000 this year. So something to think about. So I'll summarize this section. 2020 was a record year for wildfires. Most of the burning in the Coast Ranges was low and moderate severity, and the high severity areas in Chaparral are going to recover quickly. The Sierra Nevada fires and the footprints of the drought and tree mortality outbreak burned really severely, and they will have major ecological impacts. I wouldn't be surprised if we've semi-permanently lost forest on a lot of that landscape. Increasing home loss and fatalities are really due largely to the expansion of the wild and urban interface into areas of high fire risk. For decades and decades, we've been able to keep the top down on the boiling pot. We can't do it anymore. And so people moved into landscapes where they really shouldn't have been building homes. Too late now, we've got something like 3 million households living in high fire risk areas in California now. But note that there's clearly a signal of climate warming here and also increasing fuels in the forest types. And again, just to highlight that although we had a lot of burning this year and it seems extraordinary to most people, this is probably an average year in terms of burned area if you look at the last 500 years in California. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is just a little bit about the major vegetation types that dominate these two systems. I think that differences between them have a lot to do with it. Okay, so Northern California is dominated by what we call yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. Southern California is dominated by chaparral and sage scrub. I'll describe those for you now. So, okay, anyway, I went over this thing already just to remind you that fire suppression effects in that northern polygon have been huge in terms of reducing fire as an ecological force. Nearly 3/4 of the forest in that polygon have not seen a single fire in 110 years, even with all the outrageous amounts of burning that we've had recently. So these forest types are dominated by species that are fire resistors, right? Yellow pines, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, sugar pine. Whereas the current dominants are much less fire tolerant. They have succeeded as the larger trees were cut for lumber and they have been dying, being killed by beetles. And also the fire resistors cannot regenerate in the dense shade of the modern forest. So under the natural fire regime, canopies were really heterogeneous. They were open, they were disconnected from surface fuels. But under the current regime, there are dense canopies that are connected to the surface fuels. And as I noted, fire regime used to be very frequent fire at low severity. It takes about 10 to 15 years to generate sufficient fuel after a fire to reburn it, which is why the long-term fire return interval in these systems was about 10 to 15 years. But the current fire regime is one, what we would call fire regime 3 or 4, one in which fire is actually quite rare. And when it occurs, because of long-term fuel accumulation, it tends to be very severe. These species have ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine. They have thick bark. They self-prune their lower branches so that it's difficult for surface fire to catch the canopy. Cone scales are thick, so there's a decent amount of protection for seeds from at least lower fire intensities. And the needles are very flammable. These are the two most flammable species in the Western US. Obviously, they're literally fomenting fire because it kills their competitors. So there's your natural fire regime on the left with some canopy torching. There's the current fire regime on the right, very high fire severity and huge patches of high severity burning. So I'm not going to read this slide. I'll just note that the top left is, generalized picture of the way the forest used to look. This is a reference site in northern Mexico that was not logged and has not suffered fire suppression. And the bottom right is sort of a more typical picture of the way the forest looks in the Sierra Nevada, right? Very dense, lots of fuels, and the species that dominate the landscape now are not very tolerant of fire. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the time since last fire as a driver of fire patterns in yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. Forests densify and fuels accumulate in the years between fires, obviously. And so a couple of years ago, set out and grabbed all the fires that had burned since we have Landsat Thematic Mapper online, which started in 1984. I think there were about 240 fires that we analyzed. And then we basically looked at the spatial pattern of fire severity and related it to spatial pattern of time since last fire. And what you can see is if you look at the blue line, which is the aggregate, the model of the aggregate, that there's about a tripling of the proportion of area that burns at high enough severity to kill most of the canopy when the time since last fire increases from 0 to 100. So that's a major driver of fire severity. And as a result of that, you've got a huge landscape with 100+ years of fuels accumulation that when it burns is now leading to these huge patches of dead trees that are very difficult to regenerate forest in unless you can replant them. But how do you replant landscapes of tens to hundreds of thousands of hectares of nothing living anymore? That's difficult. So these huge burn severity patches are a major impediment to forest regeneration because there are not really serotinous species in most of this landscape. They're quite rare. So to get regeneration, you have to have living trees nearby. Time since last fire is also a major driver of burned area, even under modern fuel loading and climate warming, unless you're under absolutely the most extreme wind and drought conditions. You will find that burning patterns, at least within the last 10 to 15 years, are major constraints to fire growth. These are just a couple of general examples from Southern California. Butler 2 Slide in Green Valley fires burned in 2007 under relatively strong maritime winds. And you can see that within the last 10 years, that previous fuels had been reduced sufficiently by fires in that period to impede burning. And then finally, time since last fire has a really important interaction with drought. Higher time since last fire equals higher tree densities, which means there's a lot more competition for water, which means there's a lot more drought mortality when we have a drought. Much more susceptible to beetle outbreaks from sclerotinid beetles, which then, if you get a fire, leads to much more severe fire, which we think is probably going to lead to large-scale forest loss on a lot of this landscape. So then let's talk about the lowland fire regime in Chaparral. A very, very different system, right? We're talking about 6 to 10 foot high shrubs, typically very resinous fuels. This is our version of fadeboss, of course. A lot of the species that are obligate cedars are relatively short-lived, and so once you've gotten 40 to 50 years since the last fire, you have a pretty serious dead fuel load in the system. This is exacerbated by drought, right? In the early season, the fuels are pretty moist, but in the late season, they become explosive. And in this case, the canopy fuels are in contact with the ground, right? So you're going to have a high severity canopy fire, almost independent of the the burn conditions. Vegetation recuperates very rapidly after fire as well, and there's easily enough fuel on the ground under a Santa Ana wind condition, for example, to have a fire 2 years after the last one. So this is just standard burning in Chaparral. This isn't severe conditions, not a whole lot of wind in this particular picture. And you can see that this is a 30-meter flame length, but when you add a high wind to this, that 30-meter flame length becomes 40 and it's horizontal. So it's kind of difficult to stop. Species, those that resprout very rapidly. A lot of the species cache long-term seed banks that respond very vigorously to fire, especially from the Ceanothus, genus Ceanothus. They're often resin covered, so they're fire promoters. And as you probably know, a lot of the species require fire to germinate. We call these fire followers. And where we do have conifers in the system, they tend to be serotinous. So again, I'm not going to read all this, but just note that the upper left is sort of your classic picture of a healthy chaparral stand, very dense, high live fuel loadings. It has some serotinous conifers, in this case knobcone pine, scattered through it. Fire was relatively infrequent because there was no lightning in this part of the state, almost very rare. So all ignitions have essentially been anthropogenic from the very beginning. The current ecosystem, the big issue is that it's burning much more often than it used to when we're starting to see widespread degradation. This is a famous picture with John Keeley standing in it. That's got 3 different fires in the back: the Ventura fire from the Laguna fire, rather, from the 1970s. The middle one is a reburn of the Laguna fire by the 2001 Viejas fire, and the closest area is the Cedar fire, which reburned the area burned by the Viejas and the Laguna. And you can see there's a big difference in shrub cover and in the cover of exotic species on the site as well. I want to note that time since last fire is often not a major driver of burned area in chaparral fires. Fuels often play a minor role in driving fire patterns in these systems because most of the really big and let's say in economically devastating fires we get in Southern California are in October under single-digit humidities, lots of dead fuels on the site, and really dry live fuels driven by 100-kilometer winds at temperatures of 30 to 40 Celsius. It doesn't matter what the fuel structure is; the fires are going to cross all those boundaries. And the witch fire is an example. Just went through this idea. One of the things I just want to note is that in chaparral, there's sort of a rule of thumbs come largely out of the work of John Keeley that suggests that when we have fire return intervals of less than about 15 years, there's a very, very high risk of losing most of the woody component in the chaparral. Not a single fire within 15 years, but multiple fires. All right, so in terms of a summary for this section, so forest management practices, which are not all rational or have been volitional for that matter, have greatly changed forest structure and fuels in these forests. The biggest culprit is the lack of frequent low severity fire. Basically, yellow pine and mixed conifers become like very tall chaparral, and hence the very large and destructive fires that we're seeing. High density and changed composition of modern YPMC forest is leading to increased water stress, which is leading to increased tree mortality and increasingly severe fires. Southern California, in chaparral, we have essentially the opposite problem. The degradation is primarily driven by overly frequent fire, but there are a whole lot of other factors of degradation in Southern California, including pollution, heavy invasive species pressure, much more severe climate warming, and obviously 25 million people live in that 1/5 of the state. Okay, so finally, to finish up, just going to go through some general thoughts. So it's really clear that climate warming in general plays a pervasive role in a whole lot of what we're seeing. It dries fuels, it's extending the fire season, clearly influencing drought severity and length. It's decreasing relative humidities so that fires don't sit down at night anymore. It's increasing water stress, leading to more mortality, more dead fuels in the systems, and also reducing the health of individual trees and other vegetation. It's reducing the snowpack, which is going to have a major long-term impact, and it influences fire weather, et cetera. But one of the points I tried to make in this presentation is that when you compare Northern and Southern California, Southern California has had much more severe climate warming, much more severe drying, and it's subject to just a rash of humid ignitions. But fire trends have been much more subdued. And the differences between Northern California and Southern California are really not driven so much by changes in climate, but they're driven much more by differences in vegetation, different management histories, different adaptations to fire, and differences in the way that fuels are arranged horizontally and vertically. So clearly, greenhouse gas mitigation is going to have to play a major role when we talk about trying to mitigate these issues globally, but locally and regionally, management can actually be a really major player in trying to determine what the ultimate outcomes are for California ecosystems. In the forest types that I discussed in Northern California, management really needs to focus on reducing surface fuels, ladder fuels, and canopy continuity. And we've done a lot of that work, but it's all been in the wild and urban interface. But there's a really great need to expand this work to wildlands. The issue is that the economics aren't there currently. There are very few sawmills left in California. And there's not much in the way of other sort of non-traditional timber or non-timber products, at least at this point. And really, the U.S. Congress has just simply not found this to be a problem to worry about much. Maybe this year will change people's minds, but there's going to need to be subsidization of this kind of work. The scale of the issue is massive. We're talking about millions and millions of hectares across the western U.S. Plus, a lot of this landscape is in wilderness and other hard-to-access ground. So silvicultural treatment, although it's important locally and strategically, is simply not going to be able to solve the problem. And neither will the use of prescribed fire, certainly at the scales that we use it today in California, which is very small scale and very piecemeal. So we're all of the opinion that really what it's going to take is a major expansion of managing natural ignitions under appropriate conditions and letting them burn larger landscapes when we know that the conditions are going to result in ecologically beneficial outcomes. In other words, reintegration of fire as a positive ecological force may be our only hope in those landscapes. So just some examples from places that we've been working for the last 10, 15 years. This is a fuel treatment on the Peterson fire. This thing stopped the fire, obviously not on its own. There were firefighters out in this fuel treatment. But basically what we're learning is that in this kind of vegetation, under modern conditions, pre-fire fuels reduction can really be the difference between having some tree cover after fire or waiting a century or longer to get it back. This is an example closer to my home at Lake Tahoe. I just live just off the picture to the right. This fire burned in 2007, burned hundreds of homes, miraculously didn't kill anyone, but hundreds of homes were saved by pre-fire fuels reduction at the same time. The locals hated it and tried to stop it, both by chaining themselves to trees and also in court. Luckily, they didn't, because the only places on that fire that still support forest are places in these polygons where pre-fire fuels reduction had been carried out. These saved homes, lives, forest, carbon, and actually increased species diversity. We found that as well. So finally, to finish up on the forest side, I want to note that one big positive development is the development of the new land and resource management plans for the natural forests in California. They are designating large portions of the landscape for reintegration of fire as an ecological process. These are the blue polygons in the map to the right, which add up to something like, nearly 500,000 hectares across the Inyo and Sequoia National Forests, which are at the southern end of the Sierra Nevada. And essentially what will happen in these landscapes is that under the appropriate weather conditions, natural ignitions, i.e. lightning ignitions, will be allowed to burn in this part of the landscape. It'll produce a little more smoke for people, but in the long term, we're gonna maintain forest in the landscape. And then my final slide, just a couple of comments on the chaparral situation in Southern California. Really, aside from its connection to drought, climate change is not really a major driver of Southern California fire trends. It really comes down to humid ignitions and under windy and droughty conditions in the late fall. John Keely's done a lot of work on this and it has showed pretty clearly that there's not a strong climate change factor, not yet at any rate, in this system. So here the focus in management really has to be in reducing ignitions and burned area and strategically locating fuel reduction to protect homes infrastructure, because you can't avoid the fact that these systems are going to burn a lot. So in contrast to the yellow pine mixed conifer systems and other conifer dominated systems in Northern California, the Western US, chaparral sustainability is actually going to depend on reducing burned area rather than increasing the right kind of burned area, and in managing other sources of degradation as well. I believe that's my last slide. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hugh. There's an enormous amount to talk about. I want to say that I forgot to say at the beginning that Oscar Mokoteli is monitoring our chat line, colleague of mine, and I urge everyone who has comments and questions to please put them into the chat box. Oscar's monitoring that for us. And Hugh, I'm going to ask that we hold on some questions for you, which are mounting up in the chat box until after Sally has spoken. Please, I'd like to get both of you to talk because there might be comment questions as well. I certainly have quite a few questions. I've learned a huge amount from what you've presented today, and I will come back to California in a short while. So on that note, I'm going to move over. Now, Sally was meant to send me a bio, so instead I went to Wikipedia, Sally, and I read about you there, what I didn't know. So for those that don't know, Sally is a South African scientist and an associate professor at Wits University. Her research is primarily focused on savanna ecosystems within the context of climate change, as well as exploration of fire ecology and earth systems feedback. Just to note that she won an award for her co-authorship of a paper called Tree Cover in Sub-Saharan Africa, Rainfall and Fire-Constrained Forest and Savanna as Alternative Stable States. So she works with ecological data gathered from the field, remote sensing, biogeochemistry and modeling, and she's involved in lots and lots of research projects with a wide range of people all over the world, and is, I guess, our foremost expert on the relationship between fire, animal grazers, land, atmosphere feedbacks, and savannas, not just here and around the world. So I'm very grateful to Sally for making herself available for this. I guess what's important is, from South African point of view, obviously fire is a big deal here, as you'll hear. I just wanted to mention that obviously very recently we had the fires in the Free State, I'm reminded to say that the fires in California are almost mirrored by some events down here in the Western Cape where I am, and also down in the Southern Cape where we had these enormous fires which went through kind of conifer plantations near Knysna. So all of what we've heard so far certainly has resonance here, and Sally will take us into the next talk and tell us a bit more about her perspectives from our perspective. Thanks, Sally. You have to unmute yourself, and you have slides to share. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Hugh, for that really fascinating talk. And I hope that many of the issues that I bring up will be able to reiterate and contextualize some of the things you've also said. I am sharing. Am I sharing my slide? Can you see? Neville, can you see my slides?
Yep, we can see it.
Great,
Yep.
thank you.
All good, thanks.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to chat. And it's really great to see the huge audience and the diverse audience. I hope that I managed to fulfill everyone's interest. I'm actually going to start this talk about fire by talking about rainfall, not only because finally someone has named a hurricane after me, but because I hope I can demonstrate to you that it's actually quite helpful to compare fire and rainfall when we're talking about climate change. So if we think about hurricanes, hurricanes are extreme rainfall events, and there's definitely some indication that hurricanes and these extreme events are being exacerbated by climate change. And if you want to go look at that, I found a really interesting website that discusses the evidence that extreme rainfall events are linked to climate change. But I suppose I just wanted to point out that when we have a hurricane in the Atlantic or in Southern California, no one goes and looks in other parts of the world and finds places that have thunderstorms and say, why aren't you thinking about the thunderstorms in Africa? Because people have an understanding that fire regimes differ globally. So to give you an example of why I brought up the fire and rainfall connection, I wanted to link with some newspaper reports from these fires in the Amazon in 2019, which seems a very long time ago now, but it was really only last year when there was a huge amount of media outcry and scientists' outcry about the extreme fire year in the Amazon. And these fires were pretty unprecedented, and there was a lot of discussion around the role of human versus climate drivers of these fires. But just to point out, this news report was on the 25th of August, And then on the 26th of August, the BBC published this article pointing out that there were many, 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 many more fires in Africa than there were in the Amazon. So why were we all worried about the Amazon? And this became quite a big talking point on Twitter. Everyone engaged with why everyone's criticizing Brazil and letting Africans burn their landscapes and not criticizing them, which is something that I found incredibly frustrating, which is why I want to bring it up here in this audience, because everyone ought to be able to understand that different parts of the world are exposed to different fire regimes, just like different parts of the world are exposed to different rainfall regimes. So to contextualize these fires a little bit, the fires in the Amazon were burning tropical rainforest. Fires actually are really tiny. Hugh was talking about fires with flame lengths of 30 meters tall. These fires you could step over, but they still cause an immense amount of damage. Here's a picture of a fire experiment that people applied in the tropical forest, where they burned this closed canopy forest, and 10 years later, there was absolutely no recovery. So these fires are really worrisome from an ecological perspective. In contrast, the fires in Angola are burning, all of these fires here are burning Miombo woodlands. The flame lengths are, nothing to beat chaparral. They're probably about 5 meters high. But a year later, the trees are all still alive, the system has recovered. So the ecological impacts of these fires are nothing. They're absolutely not comparable to what was going on in Brazil. So it's really very irresponsible of people in the media who are supposed to be informed and informing the public to make these sorts of comparisons. So I suppose I'm putting the challenge on you as informed public to inform yourselves even more about fire regimes and also to call people out when they make these sorts of comparisons. I'm putting up a map here of global precipitation, which I think all of us, when we think about rainfall, we can conceptualize a map like this. We know which parts of the world have high rainfall, which parts of the world have low rainfall. And now I'm going to contrast this with a map which we are now able to have a really good global perspective on fire regimes. This map gives you the number of fire counts that have been observed in different patches of the globe over the last 20 years. And you can see there are parts of the world that have really frequent fires and parts that have less frequent fires. And I encourage you all to go to this link and inform yourselves about global fire regimes so that you can engage with these discussions and call people out when we need to. So just to summarize, I suppose what I'm saying is fire is like rainfall. And when we are assessing the global change impacts of rainfall, we understand the context and we understand the prevailing rainfall regime. And we should really be doing the same for fire. But there's another very important way where fire is not like rainfall. And Hugh brought this up a lot. Like rainfall, global fire regimes are impacted by anthropogenic climate change. But unlike rainfall, humans have a lot of other impacts on fire which are independent of climate, which makes it a much more complicated question to engage with. So fire ecologists really love a triangle, a fire triangle, and I thought it'd be good to put this up. It's from a paper from Max Moritz in 2005 to kind of give us a sense of how climate fits into all the other drivers of fire. We all know that at the scale of a flame, or the scale when we're trying to light our barbecue or our braai, what we need is oxygen, we need air, we need fuel, and we need a heat source. But when we scale up to the scale of an individual fire, we start to think about weather conditions and wind speed and temperatures and fuel. We're still thinking about fuel and topography. But the context of this talk and the context of these discussions are really at a level up from that, where we're thinking about not just individual wildfires, but fire regimes. So the repeated pattern of fires in landscapes. And there we need to think about and understand how climate impacts fire regimes, ignitions, and vegetation. And the complexity of fire is that humans can impact all three of these drivers of fire regimes. Humans can impact climate by, we are increasing atmospheric CO2, so we're increasing global temperatures. That can change the timing of snow melt, which can have huge impacts. It changes rainfall, and rainfall can affect fuel dryness and fuel amount. So those are all the ways that humans are affecting climate and the impacts that has on fire. But we also are one of the major ignition sources globally throughout the world. We ignite fires in places that normally wouldn't have had ignitions. And we're also really good at suppressing ignitions that would naturally have occurred, as Hugh brought up. And both of those impacts can be quite, have quite huge changes to fire regimes. And then finally, the way that people affect vegetation and how that feeds back to fire are multitudinous and varied. We plant trees where there never used to be trees, and we cut down trees where we used to have closed canopies that were fire resistant. The other thing we do is bring livestock into systems which graze the fuel, which otherwise would have burned. And finally, we move plants and animals around, and those plants can change the fire regimes because they can alter the flammability, because different plants have different capacities to carry fire, as Hugh brought up. So there's many different ways that we can alter all these three different aspects of fire regimes, which makes it really hard to pinpoint climate change and the role of climate change in driving changes of fire regimes globally. Just to summarize that, in terms of this paper that we just published last week, it was a collaborative paper where we tried to do a big meta-analysis of the effects of changing fire regimes on biodiversity. And we identified over 4,000 species that have been affected by changes in fire regime. But you can see from this picture that the changes in fire regime that have been affecting all organisms all over the world, sometimes those changes have been attributed to global climate change. But just as often, or even more often, those changes have been attributed to land use change, so changing the vegetation structure, changing the vegetation, the fuel type, or to biotic mixing, bringing in new and different types of organisms that carry fire in different ways. The other thing important to note, I suppose, is that these species, many of these species are at risk due to increases in fire, but as many are at risk due to decreases in fire. So this eastern collared lizard, for example, is at risk because people have been suppressing fires in California. Likewise, ant communities in the Cerrado are at risk because of fire suppression activities in the Cerrado. So this is just to point out the huge role that humans can have in changing fuels and how that can either exacerbate or contrast with the changes that we cause due to climate change. In fact, when we did an analysis quite a few years ago, trying to understand global fire regimes and find associations between fire regimes and climate and vegetation, we found massive parts of the world whose fire regimes were not actually very clearly linked to any climate or vegetation parameters. All blue areas that you see on this graph, the biggest correlation with all of these blue areas was that it had a very high human impact. There were many people there. So these fire regimes, which we've called intermediate cool small fire regimes, they seem to be a human-derived pyrome that probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for human activities, altering fuel structure, largely altering fuel structure, and lighting more fires in these ecosystems. In fact, I would even argue that these orange fire regimes that you see here, the frequent cool small fires in the savannas in Africa, are probably largely human-driven as well, because savanna systems like Northern Australia with fewer people tend not to have that fire regime. So this is just to give you a sense globally of the big impact that people can have on fire by altering fuel structure. So I want you to keep that in mind when we start to think about climate change and fire and trying to predict and attribute the impact of climate change on fire. And I want to start with a quote by John Keeley and Alexandra Safford from a wonderful paper they published in 2018. Predicting future fire regimes is not rocket science. It is far more complicated than that. And I hope I'll be able to explain some of the complexities in the next few slides. But I hope also that I won't make you throw up your hands in dismay, because I think we do have a good sense of how climate change is affecting fire regimes, as long as we can understand the context, like Hugh explained, and the different vegetation and the different ecosystems and how different climate drivers can affect them. So I've sort of summarized up basically, I hope, persuaded you that multiple factors drive fire regimes, climate, vegetation, and ignitions. And then the relative importance of these factors in constraining or driving fire regimes varies in different parts of the world. And ultimately, I think it's important to understand that some of these factors are far easier for us to control or to manage than others. So here's an example. I mean, Hugh's given us many examples. And here's another example. Just to contrast the types of crown fires that Hugh was talking about that you get in Northern California. Here's a graph from Westerling showing number of fires greater than 4,000 hectares over the last several decades. And then the black is temperature, so mean summer temperatures. And you can see that in periods when the temperatures are high, you have more fires, and in periods where the temperatures are low, you have fewer fires. So there's a strong link between summer temperatures, and in particular, I think, early snowmelt, and wildfires. In contrast, these are some data from Brian van Wilgen from the Kruger National Park in a grassland system in Africa, showing a really strong relationship between rainfall in the preceding 2 years and annual burned area. So what Brian van Wilgen showed that was periods that were hot and dry in the Kruger National Park had much lower fire than periods that were wet. So high rainfall, cooler periods in the Kruger Park result in more fire. High rainfall, cooler periods in Northern California result in less fire. The same climatic driver can result in a totally different fire response, depending on the vegetation and the context. Now, people often remind me, my colleagues often remind me that I mustn't use the Kruger National Park to explain the whole of Africa. So more recently, my postdoc, Swani Alvarado, and I had a look at savannas across the whole of the tropics. So this map looks at savanna vegetation across the tropics. And we were trying to do exactly what Brian van Wilgen said, which is basically to find what's the relationship between preceding rainfall and fire. So in this map, red colors mean a positive correlation. More rain equals more fire. Blue colors mean a negative correlation. More rain equals less fire. So you can see that although I'm totally correct by saying that Brian van Wilgen's results apply probably across most of southern Africa, where in all of these areas, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, periods with lots of rainfall result in more fire. There's definitely areas in Africa, and particularly in many of the Cerrado areas in Brazil, where it's actually periods of drought that will result in more fire. So I've been very active in telling the global fire community that they mustn't tell the world that hot, dry climates in the future are going to result in runaway fire feedbacks. Because I say, remember, Africa burns about 70% of the burned area globally comes from savannas. And in many of those savannas, hot, dry periods mean less fire. And I've been very firm about having standoffs with people at public conferences, that they mustn't get this idea into the public's minds that hot, dry conditions always result in more fire. However, it is true that there are definitely savanna ecosystems where we might expect increased drying to result in more fire. And here's just a graph to show you how clear that threshold is. We plotted the correlation coefficient, so red means positive relationship with rainfall and fire, against mean annual rainfall. And basically, in environments with less than 800 mils of rain that are fuel limited, more rainfall means more fire. Environments with more than 800 mils of rain, its chances are more rainfall will result in less fire. So I think it's really good to be able to have that general global perspective and be able to think about how climate change might result in different fire regimes in the future. But attribution of change in fire regimes is really easily politicized. And I was quite pleased to see the strong statements that Hugh was making, because I feel that in the last few years, it's been dangerous to tell anyone when people ask you to speak on newspapers, to speak to newspapers or speak on radio. It's been really dangerous to give this full context of fire, because people will grab what you say. The moment you say it's not all about climate change, people will grab what you say and then say, well, therefore we don't need to worry about climate change and fire. So it becomes really easily politicized. And an example of that is those fires that we had earlier this year in Australia. They're calling them the Black Summer fires because they really lasted the entire summer season. And you can see that a really large area of southern Australia burned in those fires. But there was a really big debate within Australia and globally about the degree to which those fires were caused by climate change versus driven by bad fire management in these ecosystems. And it became really difficult to talk about in a clear way. So I just wanted to highlight for people who've engaged in that media discussion that, so basically many people were saying that these fires were just because there hasn't been enough political will to do fuel reduction burns in Southern California. And if we do more fuel reduction burns, and if we can increase the area that we burn in prescribed burns, then we wouldn't have been having these dangerous wildfires. So there's a really nice paper published this year that had a look at the fuel reduction burns that were done in the last 5 years and had a look at how the effect that had on the fire severity in these systems. So the first thing to note is that the fuel reduction burns were a very small proportion of the landscape that burned. As Hugh was saying, it's a massive exercise to try to apply prescribed fire at a scale that really will stop these huge landscape level fires that are driven by, in the case of Southern Australia, 2 years of below average rainfall and incredibly hot, dry weather conditions. So these fuel reductions burns didn't actually stop any of the fires, but they did result in less intense fires, which potentially makes the fires easier to stop and also makes the recovery after fires more likely. So I think this helps us to add to the debate. I think it's very important to be clear that the Australian politicians have to take climate change seriously, and they can't assume that the firefighters and the fire managers in Southern California are going to be able to apply fuel reduction burns in a way that will prevent these damaging fires in the future. But there's plenty of room for us to engage with managing the fuel in these systems to try to minimize the impact of these extreme climate events. And similar discussions can be made closer to home. I see that many of the people in this audience are South Africans. I thought it would be nice to discuss these sorts of things in terms of fires that have affected us in South Africa. This was a really extreme wildfire event that swept through the Knysna area in the Southern Cape a few years ago. This is a map where all the pink on this map shows you the area of the fire. It wasn't large in the scale of Northern California fires, but it was incredibly damaging for the same reasons that the fires in California are damaging. There are massive amounts of property here. People's homes were damaged. And also there were issues with fuel and fuel management. So several years before this fire occurred, I was actually involved in a study with the CSIR and with insurance companies to look at trying to manage fire risk in the Southern Cape. This was a study that we did back in 2011, where we looked in the whole of the Southern Cape and we tried to map fire vulnerability based on the fuel conditions, the climate conditions, as well as the human activities and the human presence in these landscapes. You can see that we had actually identified the Knysna area as an area of very high fire vulnerability. And we went further than that because we were working with insurance companies and with local government. We really wanted to try to attribute and to try to distinguish the impact that we could have on altering fuels and how that could perhaps mitigate the effects of climate change. So we got our colleagues at the CSIR to run some climate models into the future. And as you would expect, considering the increase in temperature that we're going to see in this part of South Africa, we predicted very many more high fire danger periods into the future. But we also managed to do some analyses that showed that there was a strong impact of vegetation and that there was a very strong relationship between the percentage of alien invasive plants and fire occurrence in these regions. And we did some modeling that indicated that we could reduce the intensity of fires in this region by up to 50% if we controlled alien plants. So the knowledge was there, and it would have been a great place to test these ideas if we had managed to really nail the alien invasive plant problem in the Southern Cape. We could perhaps have tested whether we could have reduced these sorts of fires. Just to give you a bit more context of the Elandskool fire, like Southern Australia, there had been at least 2 years of below average rainfall when these fires occurred. The actual time that the fires occurred, there was very high fire danger index conditions. But even if you're in a period of extreme drought and high fire danger index, if you don't have continuous fuel loads and really flammable vegetation, you aren't going to have extreme wildfires. So we think there still would have been potential to minimize the risks in this area if we'd worked with local government and with insurance companies. So I just want to end scaling up these ideas. Africa, most of Africa is grassland savanna. And I actually had some stats comparing the types of, we can have extreme wildfires of events in grasslands, and sometimes they cause damage to property, and sometimes they kill people. But the level of damage, I think if we did a study where we summarized, and the damage from our extreme fires that we had in 2007, which swept through large parts of Southern Africa, was in the order of about 200,000 euros, whereas the numbers that Hugh was bringing up for the fires in California are many, many, many millions of dollars and millions of euros. So our grassland fires in a global context are probably not necessarily something we need to worry about in terms of global climate change. But I do want to highlight these rather unique and fascinating ecosystems that we have in Africa. Large parts of Africa consist of what we call forest grassland mosaics. It's mapped as forest grassland mosaics in the vegetation map of Africa, because you have these areas of grassland which are highly flammable, which burn every year or every couple of years, interspersed with closed canopy forest that burns incredibly rarely. In fact, hardly ever do we have records of fires burning into these natural forests. So these areas are quite extensive. They extend through Angola, through Malawi, through parts of South Africa, and large parts of Madagascar. And here we have a mosaic that has been maintained for many, many millions of years, largely due to differences in vegetation. The climate is the same. So whatever climate the grassland is experiencing, the large-scale climate is experienced by the forest as well. But the forest vegetation changes the microclimate to the point that a fire burning through these grasslands tends to go out when it reaches the edge of the forest. So here's another picture. This is a picture of the forest edge. You can see here's the grassy system that will burn very readily. And then you get a very, very clear forest edge, and you walk a few steps into the forest and you're in this very vegetation that would be very hard to ignite. Now, fires do burn through these forests. And here's an example of an ex-forest that used to exist that has now pretty much disappeared due to wildfires burning through. But in most of these instances, I actually don't know of an instance where fires have burned into this forest only due to extreme weather conditions. Usually, in this case, there would be people harvesting the wood for fuel. In the case of a firestorm that we experienced in Witwatersrand Park, there was actually alien invasive vegetation. Chromalina was growing all along this forest edge. And that vegetation is very flammable, so it increased the flammability of the forest edge. So I want to highlight that in situations like this, although I wouldn't worry too much about climate change and fires for savannas in Africa generally, climate change might make maintaining these grassland forest mosaics harder. But if we work to maintain healthy forest mosaics and limit alien invasive plants and manage wood harvesting, I think we can still manage this ecosystem in terms of global change. And that's a project that we're working on at the moment in Angola, where we're looking at how to conserve and protect these forests under climate change. Here's just a map showing you how very resilient these forests can be. This red area is the forests that got disturbed by our firestorm in Witwatersrand Park. So all of these red patches used to be forest. And the extreme firestorm, which burned under extreme weather conditions, high temperatures, high wind speeds, low relative humidity, did knock back large areas of these forests. But then in the same time, there has been periods in the last less than 100 years where there's been massive expansion of these forests. So these systems can be resilient to fire. So I've covered quite a lot of ground. I've zoomed around the world, and then I've zoomed in on various examples in South Africa. But just to summarize, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that fire is like rainfall, and extreme fire events need to be viewed like we view extreme rainfall events. They are devastating, they are problematic for humans, and we need to manage them. But that doesn't mean that all rainfall events are bad, and it doesn't mean all fire events are bad. So we should be nuanced about our value judgments and be critical of media reporting. And then there is not enough fire in some ecosystems. We really have to work to add fire to many ecosystems globally. In ways that fire is not like rainfall, is that human impacts on fuel structure and ignitions, together with anthropogenic climate change, are driving changes in fire regimes. So this means that attribution is really important. If we want to speak to politicians, if we want to speak to the media, we have to have our facts straight. It's hard to do, but I think it is possible to separate the role of climate change from human impacts on fuels. And it also means, and I was really pleased to see that Hugh agrees, that in California, as well as in places in Africa and in Australia, in some contexts, we do have potential to intervene and mitigate extreme fire events in a way that perhaps we don't have potential when we're talking about hurricanes. So there's a lot of things that we can do to try to manage our fire regimes to make them mitigate extreme fire events. And I want to end there. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Sally. Folks, we have scheduled an hour and a half. We have just about 20 minutes left. Oscar, I've made you co-host, and I'm hoping that you can unmute yourself. And there are a couple of questions that have come in. And Oscar did warn me that there's a thunderstorm brewing in Pretoria, and so he might not be able to come on. So I will open the floor to others. But what I did want to say is, I mean, it's been incredibly useful for me. I keep thinking about an outgoing president in the United States who was saying during the height of the fires how much of the problem was attributable to forest management. And I think what I've learned today is that, in fact, he might well have been right about that comment. And I guess an important take-home message, and something which struck me about Hugh's talk, was talking about how 100 years ago there was as much fire in terms of area as there might be today. But despite, and I suppose the reduction in that extent of fire has been attributable largely, especially in Northern California, to fire suppression. But now that we are sort of coming back up again to those levels, the question is what's driving that, and how much of that is simply the accumulation of fuel combined with the other drivers to bring us back to those previous levels. And again, the lesson that the fact that fire is really necessary in many of these ecosystems, and that fire suppression has been a disadvantage. And I guess ultimately that there's so much more built in harm's way and so much more ignition that the drivers effectively have changed over these long time periods. So those are sort of key threads, notional threads, that I wanted to pull out to use up the time to give Oscar, hopefully, his time to prepare. Oscar, are you there and ready to ask some of those questions?
Thanks, Neville.
Thanks, Oscar.
Neville, can you hear me?
Yes,
yep.
Go ahead.
My apologies, Neville. I think as soon as Sally started speaking, there was this heavy grey cloud moving across Centurion, and I think it's coming from Joburg, where she is. So my internet connection was a bit unstable. We've had more comments which were quite complimentary to the two speakers than questions. For example, April and Alana were quite complimentary to the speakers in terms of the information that they have shared today. And April, I think, went as far as saying that the problem is that an area that is drought-stricken, then burned, is more severe, and even roots burned, that recovery can take much longer. And there was a comment that Alana also directed to what Hugh was presenting about California. And Alana goes as far as saying that, yes, indeed, my comment was about California. He hasn't mentioned the impact of invasive alien species yet, but rather native non-fire resistant species escaping their usual niche due to fire suppression. Would be interesting to hear his perception on the role of IAPs that are playing in this picture. So I suppose that was a comment that was directed to Hugh by Alana. And I would like to actually invite Mike, Chair, if you may allow me to, because Mike Peters actually posed a very long question, which I would like him to summarize to Hugh, who was our first speaker. And I'll give it over to you, Chair, to basically go over what I may have missed in terms of the presentation that Sally made. But my parting shot would be, I thoroughly enjoyed what both speakers have shared with us. And, you know, especially some of the salient points that Sally raised about fire being almost similar in terms of impact to land use changes. So yeah, let me hand it over, Chair, if you may allow me first to hear.
There was a question. It was an IAPs directed at, in fact, there were very few questions, mostly comments, and I'll publish these comments along with the video of this so everyone can see those comments. There was a question, I think, about IAPs. I think they were to Hugh, and there's something also from William Bond, which is, I think it's referring to, well, let me just say that fires are burning over areas that burnt a year or two ago through urban areas across lawns, I guess, into vineyards. Not much fuel, but fires still spread. Seems to be extreme winds driving this dangerous trend, are their comments. So that can be a comment from either of the two speakers. And then I will open the floor to anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment. So let me just ask Hugh or Sally if they want to respond to what's been said so far.
Go ahead, Hugh.
We could flip a coin. I wanted to say, first of all, that Sally and I did not share our presentations with each other, and I was really impressed with how much overlap there was. That was nice to see. I really work, I'm a scientist that works with managers, and I don't tend to get the chance to get involved much in global scale thinking, and it was just fascinating seeing some of the things that you brought up, Sally. I do want to just refer back to Neville's comment on our current president and his take on the fuel management issue. And given that I'm a federal employee, I have to be very careful with the way that I approach things like this. But indeed, he also made a comment, maybe you'll remember, I think it was in a previous year, that people just needed to get out there and rake away the fuels. And there was just a explosion of criticism of that. And it may not reflect a nuanced and advanced understanding of the situation, but indeed, that's exactly what people should be doing. And we can't pull it off, but it gets down to the scale thing, right? Basically, we're not going to be able to rake away the problem. And indeed, it is a major forest management problem. A lot of it is, in terms of the impacts. But the thing that the current president missed on was he blamed the states for the problem, yet the problem is largely an issue on federal lands. So the comes down to having the funding and the desire in the federal government to try to solve the problem rather than at the state level. Anyway, so I will say that I feel lucky to live in California because and this is another connection, by the way, with climate change that you might not think about, but there's an economic connection in a place like California that has an active carbon cap and trade market. And what's happened as a result is that there's a certain amount of credits that are given to large emitters of greenhouse gases above some threshold. And then those credits obviously are reduced over time to reduce emissions. But those credits are bought from the state, right? There's also a market that can be traded, but the state earns an unbelievable amount of money off of this. And to California's credit, a lot of that money is reinvested in climate adaptation and climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. And almost all of the actual progress that we've made in the course of the last, say, 5 years in, you name it, but for example, reducing fuels, trying to sequester carbon in safer ways, changing the way that we emit carbon, it's coming from reinvestments from carbon cap and trade. And currently, on federal lands in California, most of the work that we're doing to reduce fuels, where reducing fuels makes sense, is actually being paid for by the state. It's not being paid for by the federal government. And indeed, I will also say that it's funding a lot of science. I think probably 80% of the people in my lab right now at Davis are actually funded from state of California cap and trade funding. So that's, anyway, that's something for you to know. So there was a question about invasive species, right? I didn't mention invasive species, you're right. I just didn't have time to do it. Invasive species are not really an issue in Northern California currently. It's really driven by endemic local species, local fuels issues. Southern California invasive species are a huge issue. Any of you who've done any study at all of the chaparral fire regime will know that if you burn the woody vegetation off, the landscape fills up with Mediterranean grasses. And increasingly South African grasses as well. And this is also the case in the borders of the desert and the Great Basin, where Bromus tectorum, what we call cheatgrass, has become a plague. And this gets at William's comment as well, is that in those landscapes, when you replace woody fuels with grassy fuels, you might decrease fire risk in the sense that it's a little bit easier to put a fire out if you have people on site if it's in grass, but it burns much more quickly, obviously, and is much more easy to ignite. And that is a big part of the problem, is that this plague of annual grasses that we now have on a lot of the landscape has led to a situation where fires move so quickly that really within a year or so you can have a fire again. And then I just want to get back to, Sally made such a great point about the importance of preceding moisture patterns, and it has a lot to do with the fuel structure, right? In California, at any rate, with the kind of precipitation levels that we get in most of the state, we're mostly worried about preceding wet years because it increases the biomass in the grass. And we know that in a Mediterranean climate zone, you know it's going to be dry in the summer. It always is every year. So the question is whether or not there was enough moisture in the wet season to generate a big grass load. And when we have a big grass load, we have big fires in the coast ranges and in the south. Anyway, Sally, you probably have something to say.
Go ahead, Sally, if you have a comment.
No, I was happy to hear what Peter had to say, I think. I was going to ask him to ask his question.
Do you mean Michael Peters? He can't talk because he's in a very noisy area, he says, where there are fire engines and sirens going off every few minutes because he says he is actually watching a fire from the LNU Fire Complex Incident Command Post.
Well, in that case, it seems like lots of people want to, I mean, the degree to which fuel management can help prevent these extreme fire events seems to be something that William brought up and many people. And it's not something that I actually have much knowledge about. I know I talked a lot with people about the Australian situation. And one of the reasons it was so extreme was not because it was burning through areas that had been burned in prescribed fires, but because it was burning through landscapes and through habitats that were usually fire resistant. So some forests that were usually fire resistant and that fires would stop, actually it burned through them. So that made it very clear that this was mostly a climate change problem rather than a fuel management problem. But I think the situation in California is different.
Sally, you said, I mean, when you were referring to the Neisner fire, you used the phrase an extreme climate event. And I guess that was an extreme climate event in the sense that the weather was in an extreme state, as you pointed out, and you showed some other data. But of course, as you also pointed out, that with sufficient management, that extreme climate event may not have resulted in the extent of the fire that it did. And then I wanted to, so that's just an observation I wanted you to confirm. And then also, just to say that obviously you spoke a lot about grassland fires and savanna fires, but in the Western Cape, I guess we're a bit more like California in the sense that, you know, it's not the preceding wet weather, it's the preceding dry weather that really matters. And we've also had a very long drought here. But interestingly, we have not seen, I don't think, the extent of fire that one might have expected after that. So these are going to be different drivers, obviously. Yeah.
We did do some analyses of that a while back, and the results are actually very similar to the chaparral. we don't, we've got lovely long-term data sets from the Western Cape, and we don't see a link with increasing temperatures, but it's all linked to human proximity to the landscape and number of ignitions. And so increasing fire happens in systems where you have more people and you have more ignitions. And when that reduces the fire return period to shorter than the system can handle, then you result in large ecological consequences. So the results are really similar to what you found in the chaparral, except that our mean fire return time, William can talk more about that, is more in the order of 15 to 30 years, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question, and I see William has posed a question, William Bond. William, do you want to ask it? You can unmute yourself, I think, if I can find you on this list. There we are. I can unmute you and you can ask it yourself if you like.
Yeah, it's the Free State fires. I have been wondering why they are so damaging. Is it because of extreme winds and weather that we have not experienced before? Because we never had livestock being killed by fire back a few decades ago in the previous generation. It would be a huge embarrassment for a farmer to lose livestock. So is it extreme weather, extreme conditions, or are the farmers just no longer knowledgeable about how to manage fires? Is it a cultural issue? And do we know?
I can't talk to you about the farmers' culture in the Free State. We know more about the Eastern Cape, I suppose. But definitely at the beginning of that drought that we had in 2015, there were really damaging fires in the Free State. So that was when the fuel was still there, but the weather conditions were really hot and windy. But those hot, windy weather conditions are not, like Hugh says, they're not that extreme and different from what we had. We might have had it less often 20 years ago. I think perhaps maybe it's also media reporting, William, because we did do an analysis. I might have some data. And definitely, there's always been livestock death due to grassland fires in South Africa. I don't know whether the extent has increased, but that has always happened. I could look it up for you if you like. We did a little analysis of all the newspaper reports of severe fire events. We had about 41 in the fynbos, 61 in the grassy vegetation, 43 deaths, human deaths in grassy vegetation, only 1 in fynbos. And then when it comes to livestock, there are 10 incidents of loss of livestock. This is just from media reports. So I think there have always been these damaging fires. I really don't know whether the ones in the Free State at the moment are anything more extreme than they have been in the past.
Interesting. We're technically out of time, and we have still got quite a good audience. And when the numbers drop off, we'll call it. But there are just 2 quick questions here. Actually, I'm going to steal your thunder, Oscar, and ask your question for you. Both Hector Chikuri, hi Hector, has asked what you mean when you say a wet season. So what's the definition of a wet season? And I assume what you mean is wetter than normal, Sally, but I'll let you answer that. And then Oscar's asked, can you comment on the use of tools to predict fire in South Africa? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I use the word wet season, I'm afraid. So in many ecosystems that are very fire prone, those are the ecosystems that have seasonal rainfall. So there'll always be a period of rainfall and a period of dry season. What we did to analyze fire in savannas was to look at accumulated rainfall over the previous several wet seasons and say, was that rainfall higher or lower than average? So we were looking at the accumulated effect of the last few years of rainfall, because that's what drives the fuel load. So that was the metric that we used. Tools in South Africa to predict fire events. There's actually some really great people in South Africa who try to do the short-term prediction of fires. They've been working with Eskom. Eskom needs to know when the fires are coming because they result in damage to their power lines and things like that. So there's been people trying to link the fire danger index to measures of fuel moisture, so to measures of curing of the grass fuels and things like that. But ultimately, fires are stochastic. So once the ignition has happened, you can predict whether it's going to be a dangerous ignition or not. But it's much harder to say we're going to have like 50 fire events next month. You can just say it's a dangerous fire period. And you've seen on the news, I think even in California, probably on the weather report, you also report fire danger. I'm sure most countries do that. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I'm going to finish with one more question just to Hugh, and that's a little bit about fire prediction in California. I would assume similarly that you have some power of prediction in terms of seasonal forecasts of climate conditions, but I'm not sure how useful those are given the complexity of what you've described, Hugh.
Well, Sally, I sort of highlighted the issue is that you can't actually predict when an ignition is going to turn into a fire, but you can certainly predict when conditions would be amenable to an ignition turning into a fire. So it's kind of tough to say. We have a system called the red flag warning that goes out through the meteorological station network, and those are usually emitted maybe a couple of days before the events are likely to happen. Very often, what we call a red flag period has no ignitions and there's no burning happens at all. Other times you have periods that aren't designated red flag periods and we have really severe burning. So it's definitely developing. I don't know if it's as much a science as it is an art, but there are different layers of fire predictive services from the national to the regional to the local scale, and some of them work well and some of them don't necessarily.
Okay, I'm going to have to call it. It's been really fascinating. I'm really grateful to both of you for presenting your perspectives to us, and I'm so glad that there's been such an alignment of your thinking, and hopefully the two of you will have more opportunity to engage and collaborate.
Nice.
And there's a lot more about fire, which I hope we will one day get back to. I'm really interested in some of the Amazonian fires and what's happening in the tundra and, these Arctic fires, which we heard about, which just brings me to the advert that please keep an eye for emails about other topics that we're going to get into. We're going to try and get into some ice and melting. And then we're also going to look at some biodiversity this year. And then next year, we'll have a new program. So I'm going to end it there and say thanks again, especially to you who has got up really early in apparently cold weather in an empty room in a COVID-saturated state. We wish you well in all senses, and to say thanks very much for all of your efforts. And I'll just call it there. I will definitely publish this video and some of the questions and comments. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet all of you.
Really fun.
Nice to meet you.
Cheers.
Take care.
Yeah. I'll end it in a short while. Been a good turnout, really good turnout.
Thanks, Neville. That was fun.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks very much. Numbers are dropping quickly. In fact, one person has just joined us. That's the wrong time zone. Okay, Sally, thanks a million. Thanks you if you're still here. I'm going to switch off in about 5 seconds. Thanks, Oscar.